She wouldn't let me eat with the others, dressed me in hand-me-downs, and kept saying, "You're only here temporarily." Then she died and left me the house. Everyone was shocked, especially her, right up until her death. The smell of breakfast cooking in the kitchen always made my stomach growl, but I learned early on not to wander in there during family meals. My aunt had made it crystal clear where I belonged, and it wasn't at their dining table. Instead, I'd wait in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen, sitting on the cold hardwood floor with my back against the wall, until she'd emerge with a plate of whatever was left over. The routine never changed. Her two kids would be laughing and chatting around the table, talking about their school projects, their friends, their weekend plans. I could hear the clink of proper silverware against real plates, the sound of glasses being filled with fresh orange juice. Then there was me, eating lukewarm scrambled eggs off a paper plate with a plastic fork, trying to make myself invisible in that dim corridor. My parents had been gone for 3 years by then. Car accident on a rainy Tuesday night when I was 12. I still remember the social worker explaining how lucky I was that my aunt had agreed to take me in. Lucky. That word felt like a joke most days, especially when my aunt would walk past me in the hallway and mutter under her breath about having another mouth to feed. The house was big enough for all of us, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and a finished basement, but somehow there was never space for me at the table. My cousins had their own rooms with fresh paint and new furniture, while I slept on an old couch in the basement storage room. The concrete walls were always damp, and in winter, I could see my breath when I woke up in the morning. My aunt never let me forget that I was different. When neighbors would come over, she'd introduce her kids proudly, talking about their achievements and their bright futures. I was always an afterthought, if I was mentioned at all. Sometimes she'd just say I was staying with them for a while, like I was some kind of temporary guest who'd overstayed his welcome. School became my escape. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I genuinely loved learning, but mostly because it was the only place where I felt like I mattered. Teachers treated me the same as everyone else. My grades were excellent, and I started to believe that maybe education would be my way out of that house. But even my academic success became a source of tension. When report cards came home, my aunt would barely glance at my straight A's. Meanwhile, when my cousins brought home B's and C's, she'd celebrate like they'd won the lottery. She'd take them out for ice cream, buy them little rewards, tell them how proud she was. I learned to keep my achievements to myself. The clothes situation was probably the most humiliating part of it all. My cousins always had the latest styles, brand-name sneakers, jackets that actually fit properly. I wore whatever was too small for them, or random items from thrift stores that my aunt would grudgingly purchase when my old clothes literally fell apart. I remember one winter when I was 15. My only winter coat was so thin and worn that I could feel the wind cutting right through it. My aunt bought her son a new heavy jacket that same week. What really stung was the way she talked about the future. My cousins were constantly hearing about college plans, career possibilities, what they wanted to be when they grew up. For me, there was only uncertainty. My aunt would make comments about how I'd need to figure things out on my own soon enough, how I couldn't expect to live there forever. The message was clear. I was temporary, disposable, not really part of the family. I started working part-time jobs as soon as I turned 16. Bagging groceries, washing dishes at a local diner, anything to earn a little money and spend time away from that house. I saved every penny I could, dreaming of the day I could afford my own place. My aunt seemed relieved that I was contributing financially, but she never acknowledged the sacrifice I was making, working 20 hours a week while maintaining perfect grades. The emotional toll was crushing. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells, trying not to take up too much space, not to ask for too much, not to be a burden. I developed this habit of apologizing for everything, even things that weren't my fault. I'd apologize for being hungry, for needing new shoes when mine had holes, for existing in spaces that weren't meant for me. My relationship with my cousins was complicated. They weren't cruel to me directly, but they'd absorbed their mother's attitude about my place in the hierarchy. They'd talk about family vacations I wasn't invited on, birthday parties where I wasn't included, inside jokes that deliberately excluded me. It wasn't malicious exactly, but it reinforced the message that I was an outsider. The worst part was how I started to internalize all of it. I began to believe that maybe I really was a burden, that maybe I deserved to be treated differently. I'd look in the mirror and see exactly what my aunt saw, a charity case, someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of kindness came my way. The confidence I'd built up in school started to crumble under the weight of constantly being made to feel like I didn't belong. By the time I turned 17, I was making serious plans to leave as soon as I graduated high school. I'd researched student loans, looked into affordable colleges far away, even considered joining the military just to get out of that house. The countdown to freedom was the only thing that kept me going through those final months. Update 1. Everything changed during my senior year when my aunt's health took a sudden turn for the worse. It started with small things that we all noticed, but nobody talked about. She'd forget conversations we'd had the day before, lose her keys multiple times in 1 week, or stand in the middle of the kitchen looking confused about what she was supposed to be doing. At first, I thought maybe she was just stressed about something, but the episodes became more frequent and more obvious. She'd repeat the same stories over and over, sometimes within the same hour. She'd get angry about things that hadn't actually happened, accusing neighbors of moving her mail or claiming that people were coming into the house at night. My cousins were in denial about it. They'd make excuses for her behavior, saying she was just tired or overwhelmed. But I could see the fear in their eyes when she'd have these moments of complete confusion, staring at us like she didn't recognize where she was or who we were supposed to be. The first time she forgot to give me dinner, I thought it was intentional. She'd always been strict about the dinner routine, so when evening came and went without her appearing with my usual plate, I figured she was punishing me for something. I went to bed hungry that night, assuming she'd be back to normal the next day. But then it happened again. And again. Sometimes she'd bring me food at random times, like 10 in the morning or late at night. Other times she'd seem surprised to see me in the house at all, asking my cousins who I was and why I was there. Those moments were particularly painful because they felt like a window into her true feelings about me. The really strange part was that during her confused episodes, she was often nicer to me than she'd ever been. She'd smile at me warmly, ask how my day was, even offer me food from the kitchen instead of making me eat in the hallway. It was like the part of her brain that maintained a hostile facade was malfunctioning, and something softer was emerging. My cousins started spending more time away from the house. They'd go to friends' places after school, stay out late on weekends, basically avoiding the reality of what was happening to their mother. I understood why they were doing it, but it meant I was often the only one around when she had her worst episodes. There was one afternoon when I came home from school and found her sitting at the kitchen table, crying. She looked up at me with such genuine confusion and fear in her eyes. She asked me if I knew where her children were, if I knew why she couldn't remember what she'd done that morning. For the first time in 5 years, I felt sorry for her instead of angry. I started helping her in small ways, reminding her to take her medications, making sure she'd eaten something, helping her find things she'd misplaced. She was usually grateful for the help, though sometimes she'd snap back to her old self and get irritated that I was inserting myself into her business. The situation became impossible to ignore when she got lost coming home from the grocery store. She'd been shopping at the same store for 15 years, but somehow she couldn't find her way back. A neighbor found her sitting in her car in the parking lot 2 hours later, crying and confused. That's when my cousins finally admitted that something was seriously wrong. We took her to see doctors, but the news wasn't good. The tests confirmed what we'd all suspected but didn't want to face. Her condition was degenerative, and it was progressing faster than anyone had hoped. The doctors gave us pamphlets about care facilities and support groups, but the reality was that she needed constant supervision. My cousins were already planning their escape routes. They were both in college, with jobs and relationships and futures that didn't include taking care of their increasingly difficult mother. They talked about finding her a good nursing home, somewhere with professional staff who could handle her needs. But something in me couldn't accept that solution. Maybe it was because I knew what it felt like to be discarded, to be treated like a burden that needed to be managed rather than a person who deserved dignity. Or maybe it was because, despite everything she'd put me through, I could see glimpses of the person she might have been underneath all that anger and resentment. I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I told my cousins that I would stay and help take care of her. I could defer college for a year, maybe 2, and make sure she was safe and comfortable in her own home. They thought I was crazy, and honestly, I wasn't sure I disagreed with them. The next few months were incredibly difficult. My aunt's condition continued to deteriorate, and taking care of her became a full-time job. Some days she was cooperative and even grateful for my help. Other days she was angry and confused, sometimes not recognizing me at all, other times blaming me for things that had nothing to do with me. There were moments when the old dynamic would resurface, when she'd remember her resentment toward me and lash out with the same cruel words she'd used for years. But there were also moments of unexpected tenderness, when she'd thank me for staying with her, when she'd apologize for things without really understanding what she was apologizing for. Update 2. About 8 months into my aunt's decline, something completely unexpected happened that changed everything I thought I knew about my situation. I was helping her organize some paperwork when she suddenly became very agitated and started talking about important documents that needed to be found. She kept insisting that there was something critical in her bedroom, something she needed to show someone, but she couldn't articulate what it was or where exactly it might be. This wasn't unusual behavior for her at that point, but there was something different about her urgency that day. She seemed genuinely distressed rather than just confused. I spent the afternoon going through her dresser drawers and closet shelves, looking for whatever was causing her so much anxiety. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect: old bills, insurance documents, photo albums, random household paperwork. But then I discovered a manila envelope hidden behind some books on her nightstand. Inside the envelope was a will, dated just over a year ago, along with several other legal documents. My hands were shaking as I read through it, because what I found there made absolutely no sense given everything I'd experienced in that house. According to the will, she was leaving everything to me. Not just a portion of her estate, but everything. The house, her savings, her car, all of it. I read it 3 times before the words really sank in. This was the same woman who had treated me like a burden for 5 years, who had made me eat in hallways and sleep in basement storage rooms, who had constantly reminded me that I didn't belong. And yet here was legal documentation that she'd chosen me as her sole beneficiary. The will was professionally prepared and properly witnessed. There was no question about its legitimacy, but it created 1,000 new questions about my aunt's motivations and her true feelings about me. Why had she treated me so terribly if she was planning to leave me everything? Was this some kind of guilt-driven decision? Or had there been some affection buried beneath all that hostility? I didn't know what to do with this information. My first instinct was to tell my cousins, but something held me back. Maybe it was the years of being treated like an outsider, or maybe it was the fear that they'd find some way to challenge the will if they knew about it. Either way, I decided to keep it to myself for the time being. The knowledge of the will completely changed how I felt about taking care of my aunt. Before, I'd been motivated by a sense of duty and maybe some stubborn pride. Now I was consumed by curiosity and confusion. I found myself studying her during her lucid moments, trying to understand what was really going on in her mind. There were times when she seemed to be on the verge of saying something important to me, but then she'd lose her train of thought or drift off into one of her confused episodes. I started to wonder if she remembered making the will, if she regretted it, if she was trying to tell me something about her reasons for writing it. The dynamic between us shifted in subtle ways. I became more patient with her difficult behaviors, more attentive to her needs, more willing to engage with her during her clearer moments. I told myself it wasn't because of the inheritance, that I was just becoming a better person, but I couldn't entirely separate my newfound compassion from my knowledge of what she'd done. My cousins noticed the change in my attitude toward their mother, but they interpreted it as me finally accepting my role as her caregiver. They seemed relieved that I was handling the situation so well, and they became even more distant from the day-to-day reality of her condition. They'd visit occasionally, but it was clear that they considered me the primary caretaker now. The guilt I felt about keeping the will secret was overwhelming at times. These were her children, and they had no idea that their mother had essentially disinherited them in favor of the kid they'd grown up treating as a second-class family member. I tried to rationalize it by telling myself that I was protecting them from unnecessary stress while their mother was still alive, but I knew that was only partially true. As her condition worsened, my aunt began having more frequent episodes where she'd talk about the past, often confusing different time periods or mixing up people and events. But sometimes, in those rambling monologues, she'd say things that gave me clues about her real feelings toward me and my parents. One evening, she started talking about my father, her brother, and how angry she'd been when he died. She said things about feeling abandoned, about being left to deal with responsibilities she'd never wanted. She talked about promises that had been made and broken, about money that had been borrowed and never repaid. It was all very fragmented and confusing, but it started to paint a picture of family dynamics that I'd never understood. I began to realize that her treatment of me might have been more complicated than simple cruelty. Maybe she'd been dealing with her own grief and resentment about losing her brother, and I'd become a convenient target for all those unresolved emotions. Maybe taking care of me had been a financial burden she'd never been prepared for, and she'd blamed me for that rather than the circumstances that had created the situation. The will started to make more sense as a gesture of acknowledgement rather than affection. Maybe she'd recognized that she'd treated me unfairly and wanted to make amends in the only way she knew how. Or maybe she'd always planned to provide for me but had been unable to show kindness while she was alive due to her own emotional limitations. During her final weeks, she had several moments of unusual clarity where she seemed to recognize the gravity of her situation. She'd ask me to sit with her and would hold my hand, something she'd never done before. She'd thank me for staying with her, for not abandoning her like she'd feared everyone would. One night, about a week before she died, she looked at me with complete lucidity and said that she hoped I would understand someday why things had been the way they were. She didn't elaborate, and by the next morning she was back to her confused state, but I felt like she was trying to prepare me for something. Final update. My aunt passed away on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was sitting beside her bed, holding her hand when she took her last breath. Despite everything we'd been through, I felt an unexpected sense of loss. She'd been the only family I'd had for 5 years, and even though our relationship had been complicated and often painful, her death left me feeling strangely empty. My cousins arrived within hours of getting the call. They were genuinely grief-stricken, and I found myself comforting them even though I was dealing with my own confusing mix of emotions. They thanked me repeatedly for taking such good care of their mother, and I could see the relief in their eyes that they hadn't had to witness her decline as closely as I had. The funeral arrangements were made quickly. My cousins handled most of the details while I dealt with the immediate practical matters around the house. Everyone assumed that I'd be moving out soon, probably going to college or finding my own place. People kept asking me about my plans, and I gave vague answers because I honestly didn't know what was going to happen next. 3 days after the funeral, my aunt's attorney called to schedule a meeting about the will. My cousins were surprised that there was a formal will reading, but they assumed it was just standard procedure. They figured their mother had probably left them the house and maybe set aside some money for my education or something similar. We met at the attorney's office on a Friday afternoon. My cousins were relaxed and chatting about their memories of their mother while we waited. I was nervous in a way that I couldn't really explain to them, knowing what was coming but not knowing how they'd react to it. The attorney was professional and straightforward. He explained that my aunt had prepared a comprehensive will about 14 months before her death, and that it was legally binding and properly executed. Then he began reading the relevant sections aloud. The silence in the room was deafening as he read through the provisions. Everything was being left to me. The house, her savings accounts, her car, her personal belongings, everything. There were no specific bequests to my cousins, no sentimental items set aside for them, no acknowledgement of their existence as her children in the legal document. My cousins' faces went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally a kind of shocked hurt that was painful to witness. They looked at me like I was a stranger, like I'd somehow manipulated or tricked their mother into changing her will. The older cousin started demanding to see the documents, insisting that there had to be some mistake. The attorney patiently explained that there was no mistake, that the will had been prepared by their mother of her own free will, and that she had been mentally competent at the time of its creation. He showed them the signatures, the witness statements, the notarization. Everything was legitimate and legally binding. The accusations started flying immediately. They claimed I must have pressured her into changing her will, that I'd taken advantage of her declining mental state, that I'd manipulated her emotions by staying to take care of her. They couldn't understand how their mother could have made such a decision, and they were looking for someone to blame. I tried to explain that I'd been just as surprised as they were, that I'd had no idea about the will's contents until after she died, but they weren't interested in hearing my explanations. They were dealing with a double loss, their mother's death and the complete overturning of their expectations about their inheritance. The attorney suggested that we all take some time to process the information and schedule another meeting the following week. My cousins left the office without speaking to me, and I could see that our relationship, such as it was, had been permanently damaged by this revelation. I spent the next few days alone in the house, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I kept going over my memories of my aunt, looking for clues about her true feelings toward me. I remembered moments of unexpected kindness that I'd dismissed at the time, brief conversations where she'd seemed genuinely concerned about my future, small gestures that I'd interpreted as guilt rather than affection. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my aunt had been fighting an internal battle for years. Part of her had resented me for the burden I represented, for the reminder of her brother's death, for the disruption to her family's life. But another part of her had recognized that she was my only family, that she had a responsibility to provide for me, that maybe she even cared about me in a way she couldn't express. The will wasn't just about money or property. It was her way of acknowledging that I belonged somewhere, that I had a right to security and stability, that I was more than just a temporary inconvenience in her life. In death, she'd given me what she'd never been able to give me while she was alive, a sense of belonging, a real home, a future that wasn't dependent on other people's charity. My cousins attempted to challenge the will, but their attorney advised them that they had no grounds for a successful contest. The document was properly executed, their mother had been competent when she signed it, and there was no evidence of undue influence or coercion. They eventually accepted the reality of the situation, but they made it clear that they considered me responsible for their mother's decision. I decided to accept the inheritance, but I couldn't bring myself to feel triumphant about it. I understood now that my aunt had been capable of love, but she'd been unable to express it in healthy ways. She'd shown her care through criticism and control, her concern through constant reminders that I needed to be prepared for independence. The will was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever done regarding her feelings about me. The house feels different now that it's legally mine. I've moved out of the basement storage room and into one of the proper bedrooms upstairs. I eat at the kitchen table, use the good dishes, park in the driveway. But I haven't forgotten the years I spent eating in hallways and sleeping on damp concrete. Those experiences shaped who I am, and they've made me appreciate security and dignity in ways that people who've never lacked them might not understand. I never received the apology I thought I wanted from my aunt, but I got something more valuable, recognition that I mattered, that I had worth, that I deserved to be provided for and protected. The inheritance wasn't just about financial security, it was about being seen as a real person with legitimate needs and rights. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive my aunt for the way she treated me during those 5 years. The emotional damage from constantly being made to feel unwanted and burdensome will probably take years to fully heal. But I've come to understand that she was fighting her own demons, dealing with her own losses and limitations, and that her cruelty toward me was more about her own pain than about who I actually was. The house is mine now, but more importantly, I finally have a place where I truly belong. I'm not a temporary guest or a charity case anymore. I'm home.